I'm grateful for this opportunity to do this session with you because it has given me a chance to think through a problem, or at least initiate the process of thinking through a problem. A process that is of course not complete, because thought is never complete. I'll be dead if that gets completed and I'm ready to be alive. So it never. Okay. So Continental philosophy of language is a project that is being explored by several of you in this department. This is what I gathered. And in Continental philosophy, of course, there are innumerable scholars who have dealt with language, right? The two most prominent on-your-face examples are Habermas on one side, Gadamer on the other. There is a whole big controversy there, controversy of, does language have a critical power, or, or is language, is that critical dimension of language already embedded in the continuum called dialogue, you know? So this is one kind of debate that has gone on in the domain of Continental philosophy, which had a lot of attention in the 60s. Later on, of course, it became a big debate between Habermas on one side and the postmodernists on the other, the philosophical discourse on modernity and so forth. Those of you who are doing your thesis on Habermas are, of course, well versed in this. Can we really talk about language as universal, as transcendental, as critical? That is one thing, that exploration that has taken place, and it's something on which Dr. Dipti Gangavani has written, and I'm grateful because it is an old essay, and it is an essay that I'm able to now circulate to the students because of the bilingualism also there. But besides this, when we go to the early stages of Continental philosophy, say the phenomenological moment in Continental philosophy, there is a good amount of language philosophy there. Professor Tarakan, I believe, has already discussed this with you, so it might be a repetition. I wish I had asked you what you were doing, but it doesn't matter, because in philosophy we all say I come behind you and say the same thing again. So that's what philosophy is all about. There is the phenomenological tradition also in language, which tends to get neglected in mainstream philosophy, and it is something that I wish to discuss today, because the question that I'm going to ask is, does phenomenology become hermeneutics when it adopts a very explicit linguistic tone? You know, so that is a question that I'm going to ask. Okay. And does it become deconstruction when it acquires an explicit linguistic tone? How do we then distinguish between phenomenology, hermeneutics, and deconstruction when Husserl becomes very explicitly linguistic in his later work, The Origin of Geometry, which is this very, very small essay on which Derrida has written that very important commentary, from which I draw extensively. And it is also a work, this essay is a part of his later work, The Crisis of the European Man. That it was published posthumously. So much of what he says here actually contradicts what he says in the logical investigations. So does phenomenology lose its identity then? You know, that is the big philosophical question that I'm trying to ask here. Of course, now on the analytic philosophy debate, Professor Chandra has talked all afternoon, and it is an important debate. In my opinion, there is an very strong discussion of language in continental philosophy also. It is just that it has not been, we don't talk about it. I don't know why. As much as we should be talking about it, we don't. And there is another angle here for Heidegger scholars, which I'm not touching on, since I was trying to bring in different dimensions of language. Heidegger, of course, also has got a very strong philosophy of language in his early work. He discusses language from the point of view of Mitsein and Rede, that is as discourse. In his later writings, he said typically the argument is, the observation rather, is that he becomes very esoteric. But is he that esoteric? And if poetry becomes the foundation of language, doesn't that enrich language philosophy more with that sense of ambivalence that he brings? So that's another question, and there isn't enough time to explore that question. So I'll just stick to the plan of talking about Husserl. So I've just prepared this PPT to make communication a little more easy for me. We'll be looking at the phenomenological perspective on language with reference to Husserl, and there is the early Husserl and the later Husserl that we will be exploring. The Husserl of logical investigations on one side, that is the earlier Husserl actually, and the Husserl of origin of geometry. There are two perspectives on language. This is what I'm going to argue, that in his earlier view he has a notion of language as a ratiocinator, and he brackets out the communicative aspect, as we all know. He literally says we need to bracket out the communicative aspect, but in the later writing he precisely introduces this communicative aspect of language. The conclusion, I'm going to explore whether he'll have to give up the idea of phenomenology as a rigorous science. Now, before I proceed ahead, I just want to mention a couple of articles on which I have very heavily drawn in order to discuss this. One is, of course, Derrida and the origin of geometry, his commentary on origin of geometry. That is one work. But there is another work on which I have derived very, very heavily from. So, to begin with, what is phenomenology trying to do? Phenomenology is, to put it very simply, I would look at it as an attempt to describe, So it's a description that one is trying to offer. In the case of Husserl, there is a description that is offered. He tries to articulate a way of describing consciousness in all its purity, in all its objectivity, whereby it is not affected by the vagaries of change, by the vagaries of psychology and so forth. Okay, that is what he tries to do. But then, even for someone like Heidegger, okay, who would not agree with this so-called ideality in part of Husserlian phenomenology, phenomenology is still an attempt to describe. It is an attempt to describe being. Merleau-Ponty would say that it's an attempt to describe the embodied self. So, different approaches to descriptions or different objects of description, just to oversimplify. Now, in this context then, when we think of phenomenology as an attempt to describe, where do we locate language? Obviously, in order to describe something, we need language. Description is not possible in a way without engaging with language in some sense, right? So that is where language enters into phenomenology, and he notes, as Husserl notes in formal and transcendental logic, he says that he is committed to logos. Okay? Logos is a Greek word, and it's a Greek word for reason, Greek word for thinking. So it can mean many things. It can mean thinking, and thinking not necessarily logical thinking, but thinking in ways that are loose as well. So he captures, and it also means, it also has an affinity with language. So Husserl captures all of this by saying that the starting point of the signification of the word logos is speaking, thinking, what is thought. Okay? So this is basically what it's all about. So there is language, there is thought, and there is a certain overlap of the two in the word logos itself. To quote from the same source, formal and transcendental logic, in developed language, logos sometimes signifies word or speech itself, sometimes that which is spoken about, the affair complex referred to in speaking, but also on the other hand, the propositional thought produced by the speaker, either for the purpose of communication or for himself, the mental sense, as it were, of the esoteric sentence, that which the speaker means by the expression. Okay, so, but particularly where to continue, it's a huge quote, where scientific interest is active, all the significations of the word logos taken on a more pointed sense, please correct that, because the idea of a rational norm enters into them. Logos then signifies sometimes reason itself as an ability, sometimes the action of rational thinking, that is thinking that has a quality of insight or thinking directed to a truth given in insight. Okay? So logos has this several layers of meaning attached to it. Okay? On one side something objective, the other hand something subjective. On one hand something linguistic, on the other hand something that is purely conceptual, and it's a mixture of all of this, and it is this mixture that defines logos. So logos is this mixture of all of this, and it is precisely this sense of logos that enters into Husserl's writings as well, where there is this struggle that he has between the objective and the subjective, that which is reasoning as per rules versus reasoning loosely. All of this plays itself out in Husserlian phenomenology, and particularly in his account of language. So Merleau-Ponty, in his essay, in an essay that he had on Husserl, would say that, I'll just cite you that particular essay. Yeah, Phenomenology and the Science of Man. In this essay, he would say that from the beginning to the end, Husserl tried to discover a kind of a via medium between logism and psychologism. Okay? So, between the objective and the subjective, between the two poles, how do we balance them, you know? And I would say add here between thought and language also. So in logical investigations, that is where there is a detailed account of language which you've already discussed in the morning. So I'll probably go through it very quickly. The first chapter here on expression and meaning. A certain notion of language emerges which is well, the notion of language that is not quite the intersubjective dialogical notion of language, but the notion of language as a kind of a calculus. Okay? So what is that all about? How does that occur? You know. So his big question is what? What is meaning, right? And this requires the grasp of ideal meaning. And in order to grasp ideal meaning, we need to perform the phenomenological reduction. It is epoche. Of course, to reach the reduction, we need the epoche. Epoche is bracketing. It allows us to change our attitude by bracketing, keeping some things away, suspending judgment, etc. We change our attitude. We shift our attitude from what to what. From a very natural way of looking at the world to a phenomenological way of looking at the world. So, einklammern, or to bracket, what do you bracket? You bracket out, you keep aside the communicative functions that work in dialogue. So, he's very clear about it. And you also suspend, Haushalten, so it is keep aside and to suspend, both. It has a dual meaning, epoche. The active speech situation, so we are often always in a very active speech situation, communication situation, etc. We have to keep all of this aside. And when we keep all of this aside, when we keep this kind of speech and received meaning aside, there is a certain change in attitude that would result, and this change in attitude would result precisely because we get away to a solitary mental world. So we leave the world of chatter and we enter the solitary mental world, and when we enter the solitary mental world, we are able to grasp that ideality of meaning. Now, there is some kind of an appeal, I think, in today's era of social media, where we are constantly inflicting each other with received meaning, of terms like dissent, nationalism, protest, etc., etc., JNU even, I mean, call it whatever, what have you, yeah? We find that there is a certain sort of consensus on the meanings of words, and that consensus keeps floating around. And so, in that context, we can't really but help think that the best thing to do would be to sort of get away from that consensus and explore the term nationalism, nation, etc. in all its purity, in the solitariness of our mind. Now this requires what Noe points to, semantic reduction, which is what he articulates in this particular section. Yeah. Now, what is this? What it requires? It has, that is a certain turn to original meaning, right? Ideal meaning, the meaning in all its purity, in all its universality. How do we do it? Now, it requires for Husserl taking 3 steps at this stage. He has, of course, refined this method over and over again. So I've picked up 2 parts only to contrast them with each other from these 2 texts. Yeah. So the first step is making a very important distinction, and that distinction is between an indication, Anzeichen, and expression, Hausdruck. So what is the difference between an indicative and an expressive term? An indicative term would not have, it only indicates something. It is just an indicative sign. It does not express meaning. An indicative is also bound up with the physicality of the sign. So if we were to say that a flag is an indicative, it is linked to the physicality, and it is a kind of a distraction from the ideal
plurality of meaning, so we would have to keep this aside, this indication aside, in order to concentrate on the, well, expressive side, which is what takes us to meaning, according to Husserl. Now, he would also then talk about, secondly, excluding or suspending or putting inside parentheses all of our facial expressions and various gestures, because, well, they would distract us, they would also influence us too deeply and take us away from the objectivity of the matter, and they're too bound up with the exteriority of things, you know, and the whole point is to make an interior term. So that which takes us away from the interior, we need to keep that aside, so we keep this aside. And then finally he would also say that we need to keep aside the communicative functions of expressions, and communication is of course a very important aspect. It's something that he has recognized, just as indications are important, facial expressions are important, all of this is important for a certain purpose from the natural point of view of the naturalistic attitude. However, these they are helpful because they are shortcuts, they oversimplify, they make things too clear, etc. And that is precisely what hinders our search for that perfect ideal meaning. And so the search for that perfect ideal meaning would require keeping aside this communicative function, so that we can explore our inner life, our inner experience better. So, an expression then, after performing this reduction, where we keep aside indicatives, that which is superficial, just pointer, etc., or we keep aside our facial expressions, we keep aside communication. So, after suspending all of this, we start exploring an expression, that particular expression, for its meaningfulness. So it is as meaningful as the inner experience of the speaker. So as long as the speaker has a very rich inner experience, this would be deeply meaningful, but it is not quite the experience in the psychological sense of the term that he is talking about, in fact. Speakers, it is not even an experience in that sense, because speakers have an intuitive grasp of meaning that occurs to them, and it is that intuitive grasp of meaning that you're going to get when you isolate in your isolated mental life. And it would not indicate anything. Isolated mental life would in fact open up that expression to a certain purity of meaning, which is not even tied to specific mental images or psychic experiences, or so that is from the point of view of the inner life. The inner life distractions of image, individual experiences, those are also ruled out in order to, well, grasp that meaning in all its originality. He would in fact say this, that language does not have much of a role to play. He says this very clearly. The word's non-existence, right, neither disturbs nor interests us, since it leaves the word's expressive function unaffected. So what is Husserl trying to do? He's trying to get to a certain pre-linguistic stratum of meaning. He is trying to see what is it that is left behind when we get rid of all the sounds associated with the word, the clamor, the sensuous acts that surround the expression, even the psychical experiences when we, from the inner side and the outer side, when we get rid of these distractions. What is left behind? What is left behind is, well, the meaning conferring act or the meaning intending act. And the meaning intending act is that moment when one intuitively apprehends meaning, to use his term, in all its perfection in that particular act. And it is something that would allow us to, well, get away from the, it is the age-old Platonic dream, in a way, that Parmenidean dream, Platonic dream, that that which is impermanent, that which is changing, can't really give meaning. Genuine meaning is that which is stable, that which is there, that which is perfectly static, So the meaning conferring act is the most important. This meaning conferring act is termed by Derrida, as we all know, as the voice. So it is the voice that has to speak from within, and that voice pronounces. And phenomenological description is actually a description of this meaning conferring act, and this is possible only when we get away from the inessential external and internal domain. When we get away from language of a certain sort, language as dialogue and so forth. So external relations are excluded, language is excluded, and he rejects the natural attitude, which is naive according to him, takes things for granted. So if we have to really, what is important, I think, is this quest for something that is not prejudiced. And this quest for something that is not prejudiced, getting to a moment which is the same for everybody, is what he is trying to articulate here, in keeping with, of course, the tradition of Descartes. He called himself later on a 20th century Cartesian and so forth. So it is in keeping with this tradition. Now, Derrida, of course, in his Origin of Geometry as well as Speech and Phenomena, two works where he has explored Husserl very explicitly, would say that when he goes on to discuss the transcendental reduction, he would describe this as subject-object unity. The noetic and the noematic sphere of consciousness are unified in this, the subject side as well as the object side. So, is there a language in this, in this particular account that Husserl gives us of phenomenological reduction? Because typically the argument is that there is no role for language at all. So, following Noé, and following Banchetti Robino, who has written a very interesting article on Husserl's account of language in investigations as well as in formal and transcendental logic. It is called Husserl's Theory of Language as Calculus Ratiocinator. I would say that there is a conception of language here. What kind of a notion of language is this? This is a notion of language that is perhaps similar to Russell, and so, is there such a big divide really, between the two traditions, and are we not reproducing a colonial mindset when we go on harping about this divide? Right. So the notion of language as a calculus is different from the notion of language as a universal medium or a lingua characteristic. That the difference is that the later notion of language as a universal medium, which is something that hermeneutics would perhaps adhere to, would be a perspective which would argue that everything is constituted by language. So our very thoughts are not possible without language itself. And does this bring in linguistic relativism the way Banchetti Robino argues? I don't think so. But there is the danger of course, linguistic relativism in this. So we are trapped in a certain language. It is not possible to have a meta language. Now, does this lead to only formalism as the path? Well, this is also something that I would say is debatable. But in any case, Husserl does not subscribe to the view that in this work, at least in his earlier work, or language as a universal medium. So in fact, in logical investigations, he would very clearly talk the previous work, an early work, logical investigation. He would speak about two dimensions being there to all our meaning intending or meaning conferring acts. I'm using the two in a very loose way as equivalent. So we are on one side sensuously aware of the physical sign. We are intellectually aware of apprehending of the intuitive meaning, and there is a certain unity. Now, it is this meaning intending act which underlies all word usage. He says this very explicitly. So, prior to any custom or any convention determining meanings of words, there is an original act of conferring meaning which is at the bottom of language, which is for Husserl very important because it is what gives objectivity to the expression. And it is meaning intention is related to language through expression. A linguistic sign that does not have meaning is not an expression. An expression is a unity for Husserl of a physical symbol and a fixed meaning, a meaning and a symbol of some sort. And it is, Mohanty uses this term which I read in Banchetti Robino. I would like to go back and look at it in Mohanty. That this expression is animated by meaning. So the expression does not express meaning. It does not express meaning in the sense of having an objective relationship to it, but rather meaning is a part of its being itself. And the word is united with meaning intention, which could or could not be related to meaning fulfillment. So your meaning fulfillment, as we know, may or may not happen. I may say round square, it still has meaning, although it may not be fulfilled. But something like abracadabra does not have meaning and it is not also fulfilled. So Husserl would, what is he trying to do? He is getting away from psychologism, of course. Famously, his argument against psychologism. He is getting away from all nominalistic theories of expressions. So verbal expressions, I quote here from his formal and transcendental logic. Verbal expressions are no doubt often accompanied by images. So whenever we use verbal expression, they are accompanied by images, they are accompanied by thoughts. They may stand in a very close relationship, they may stand in a very distant relationship to meaning, but to treat that which accompanies meaning as a necessary part of meaning is problematic. It runs counter, he says, to the plainest facts. So, in any assertion which is conceptual or a perceptual judgment, it involves meaning, not a mental image. It does not involve an experience either. And it is why is he saying this? You know, now in his early view of language, what Husserl wants to do is he wants to make meaning available to everyone. That everyone should, well, apprehend meaning in the same way. That's the whole idea. Getting away from the prison house of the self, subjective meaning, getting away from subjective meaning for there to be objective meaning. we should get rid of mental imagery, we should get rid of this whole psychologism. So if this is the case, then language for him offers a sign system to express his thought, but though no one can do without it, it is an imperfect aid to strict research. In his early writing, to conclude this particular discussion, language is actually got a lot of pernicious ambiguity, and as the pernicious ambiguity of syllogistic inferences, he says, language also reproduces a similar pernicious ambiguity, and it is something we need to really stay away from if we were to reach that ideal meaning. So the whole idea, I think, of reaching ideal meaning in my interpretation, this is not from Blanchetti, Robino, or from Noé. I think that this whole idea of objectivity in Husserl is precisely to facilitate a certain intersubjectivity in a twisted way there, that all of us should agree upon that objective meaning. Each of us should not have our own subjective notions of meaning, or we shouldn't browbeat each other into accepting one partial notion of meaning the way we do with social media. It is in order to get away from this that he offers a certain very strict account of language. I use the word strict in the sense of Husserlian sense, removing the a posteriori and making it as a priori as possible, right? That is what he's trying to do here, and this would help us articulate rigorous science of phenomenology, rigorous science in the sense of describing our mental life in a thoroughgoing way. Now, ontological commitments are bracketed out in phenomenology, and in a similar way, ontological commitments of language can also be bracketed out, and with that kind of method that we have of reduction, we have a similarly a reduction in language itself, that could work in tandem with this. The notion of language as not dialogical, but as kind of a calculus, not a mathematical calculus, but where there is an objective body of words which can be transferred, used, shuffled around without subjective agendas entering the picture. So for there to be an objective use of language, and for there to be a genuine kind of intersubjectivity vis-a-vis science, this is important according to early Husserl. Now, what happens is another view of language also emerges in Husserl, and this happens with his origin of geometry. The origin of geometry, which is a part of his phenomenology and the crisis of the European man, the crisis of European sciences and transcendental phenomenology. It's from this text, the crisis of European sciences and transcendental phenomenology. So in this text, there towards the end, as almost like an appendix, there is one little essay there. Now, what happens in this? So we find that Husserl is actually moving here to a kind of a hermeneutics. Okay? That it is almost like he is moving, as Noé says, from a phenomenological reduction to a hermeneutic reduction. And the origin of geometry, the text, it's not so much about how geometry factually originates, because this is something he would say is a part of your naturalistic world. That is not what he's trying to do. So what is he trying to do here? He's trying to understand how can geometry retain the ideality of meaning that it has? How does that ideality of meaning persist through diversity of context, persist through the changes that take place? Because geometry is something that is done in different contexts, but then geometry is for him also spatial. Geometry is for him also a spiritual accomplishment. Okay? So it is not just kind of a narrow quantitative perspective, it is something that he approves and appreciates in a very, very Greek way almost, the notion of geometry as something spiritual. So yeah, in the same text, he says that geometry, crisis of European sciences, it's a total acquisition of spiritual accomplishments, and the whole problem is the problem of identity. How can that ideal object retain its identity through the temporal processes that it is subject to? You know? Now, you'll have to forgive me for the change in font because it's gone all haywire in the middle. Some of it is also, it's a reflection of time and how the constitutive role of time. So it's something that you do at 2 a.m. may end up like this. You know, part of it is all perfect and part of it, and then even when you correct it at 2 p.m., it doesn't change. Okay, so he asks a very crucial question. How geometrical truths, how can geometrical truths transfer from the subjective evidence of the first inventor, right? So there is a geometrical truth that the inventor has. And this inventor who has geometrical truth arrives at this truth, as Derrida puts it, in an intrapersonal way also. So there is a dialogue with oneself, etc., that could very well happen, and you arrive at the geometrical truth. So how do you move from there to the objective, intersubjective world? Because this truth has to be transferred to others, right? So how are you going to do that? That is the question that he asks, because for it to be ideal, for it to retain that ideality, it has to change, it has to move. I mean change, I use it again in a colloquial way. It has to, transmit. It has to be transmitted from my mind to yours. So how does that happen? How can it make this movement from my mind to yours? Because that movement is very important for ideality, and ideality cannot just be mine. This is what we have seen also earlier. The whole idea of looking for ideal objective meaning is to find something that belongs to us, not just mine, but something that belongs to us. You know. Now, the ideality of geometry, of course, is not semantic. It is not just physical, but it is for him an ideality of objects. So it is not just the ideality of meaning, it is not just the ideal physical ideality, but something deeper, that there is something like a geometrical object and it has a certain stability. So how does that stability retain itself, right? So his answer is that there is something like a linguistic living body, or the Sprachleib, which makes this possible. So it is possible through the Sprachleib, language through which it receives. There is a language which is receptive, actually, not just the language of the speaker, but interestingly the language of the receiver, and that also receives the linguistic living body. So it is actually possible when ideality of geometry coincides with historicity. When the ideality of the geometrical object comes into contact with historicity, that ideality is preserved. This is almost a paradox, you know, that what Derrida would talk about, that it is by getting away from phenomenology, that phenomenology becomes possible at all, because by introducing history, you make phenomenology possible, for that idea to be possible. That impurity of history makes the purity of phenomenology possible. So this is so different from logical investigations. Logical investigations where Sprachliebe has to be, well, bracketed out, right? It is an external dimension, it is non-essential, it is pre-linguistic and so forth. And ideal meaning is constituted in investigations in the silence, in a way. It is a silent constitution. Language does not have a constitutive role to play. It does not add to the meaning, whereas here language actually adds to the meaning. So language does not intervene, here language intervenes. So origin of geometry invokes that excluded Sprachliebe, and it is the inevitable moment in the constitution of any kind of ideality, geometrical ideality in this case, and it participates in this in a very active way, according to Husserl. This is a new perspective on language. It is not a self-contained system. It is not a personal linguistic competence. This is also important. He says it very clearly. It is not a personal linguistic competence. So it is this subjectivism is something that Husserl has been fighting against, throughout. I think that is a common theme that emerges. So what is it that cements this ideality of meaning and makes it move from one to the other? It is a linguistic community. So, what is a linguistic community? A community, quote here from the same text, the crisis text, a community of those who can reciprocally express themselves, normally in a fully understandable fashion, right? So, it is a community of speakers, it is a community of listeners, it is a community of those who can exchange, give and take interpretations. And he says that this is the horizon of civilization. It is the V horizon, the horizon of civilization. So the constitutive function of language is not confined to an individual subject, but it is rather anchored in the linguistic ability of a community that is intersubjective, that shares, that which has got a certain give and take possible. So the objective world that we talk about in phenomenology, right? That is the whole point, that we should not zone off into our own private world, that there is an objective world that one has. So it is a world where everyone has a world horizon, he would say, and objective being presupposes, this is a quote, men, human beings, understood as human beings with a common language. Thus, human beings, men as men, fellow men, world, the world of which men, of which we always talk and can talk. Of course, the masculine pronoun we have to change it here. So, this is the common world, right? Common world which we as human beings refer to, about which we talk, with which we think, and language is inextricably tied to this world as a unity. It is a horizon, and objectivity is reached because of this, that this kind of a V horizon enhances or promotes empathy and dialogue. And now the big question is, fine, there is the whole metaphysics of presence problem, right, that Derrida has talked about, that is it only the living beings who are alive right now as we are here, who can exchange ideas with each other and who can talk to each other, who are capable of transmitting the ideality of meaning? What happens when somebody is dead and gone? Euclid is dead and gone. What happens then to that ideality of meaning, right? So, in fact, he says that what is in fact missing so far, we need to examine the persistence of an ideal object even during periods where the inventor and his fellows are no longer wakefully so related or even are no longer alive. He actually says this, right, in Origin of Geometry, and he says that how can writing persist? Well, this almost sounds like Derrida. The persistence, how can ideality persist? It persists because of written, documented linguistic expression. Because you write it. And when you write it, you go back, you revisit it. It makes communication possible without immediate or mediate personal address. It is not personal. That also makes it very significant, because Husserl is also like Derrida trying. I'm harping on this again because both have the same, I think, commitment, that we thinking beyond the subjective. So getting away from the personal address, or that is something that we constantly seem to be doing. So when written, when we write down that ideal thought, right, that geometrical thought which is ideal, when we write that concept down, it is sedimented into a text. It becomes a text. That which is written becomes a text, right? And the reader can go back and revisit the evidence, and the sedimentation is there on one side, and when the reader reads that text, there is a reactivation of that. So it is between sedimentation and reactivation, between the written expression and the interpretations, the thought, that the conversations that center around that written term, that ideality is maintained. And in a way, geometry is communalized in this sense again, it's a term with so many layers of meaning. We always think of it, in the Indian context, it is one, and then when Husserl writes it, it's something else. So, it is the opposite. In fact, I think we should promote this on social media. We will only talk about Husserlian language on social media. Communalization, an ideal object capable of being passed, it becomes a tradition of sorts, right? So this is Husserl. So there are two Husserls here. Two Husserls. One is the Derrida himself says this. There is a radical Husserl who questions everything, returns to things themselves, gives us a very radical description of alterity. So that Husserl is there. But on the other hand, there is also the Husserl who is very oversimplistic, almost like removing all difference, homogenizing everything. So there is that Husserl as well. So we need to read Husserl in this double way that Derrida has done. Of course, Derrida has not explicitly discussed the two perspectives on language, but if we read him in this double way, we realize that this segregation of phenomenology from hermeneutics might be a little oversimplification, little bit of an oversimplification, little bit of a naivety, because phenomenology itself is possible because of hermeneutics, because without conversation, without the dialogue that we are here, of course I use Gadamer's term, without that universal medium that constitutes language, how can we really even articulate these ideal objects, what sort of fractures Husserl, according to Derrida, is the contaminating moment is life itself, right? So if we were to bring in life, life is contaminating, and because of that, ideality is possible. So Derrida's, of course, critiqued Husserl. We are aware of that. Criticism, logocentrism, phonocentrism, monologue. These are typically the critiques that he has offered. But perhaps Husserl, my point is that Husserl perhaps recognized this himself while writing The Origin of Geometry, and also foresaw that in order to reach that moment of description and phenomenology, one would have to deconstruct a great deal. So maybe this is what he's trying to say here. What he's perhaps also trying to do is, we see two versions of philosophy coming up. You know, Rorty, when he discusses Derrida's account of Husserl, Derrida's commentary on Husserl, makes a distinction between two conceptions of philosophy. He says that there is what is called the abnormal inquiry. Philosophy is an abnormal inquiry where we want to come up with some very radical truth that is foundational, that is metaphysical, etc. Vis-a-vis, there is the normal inquiry, where, he develops this from Kuhn, of course. Normal inquiry where you're not just trying to reach something deeper, but you're just going on doing what you're doing for the sake of doing it, in a way, because it's an ongoing practice. So perhaps the notion of language here in Husserl is, the later Husserl would be someone who is not looking for a deeper meaning, in which case phenomenology would not be a rigorous science. It would be, in fact, not a science at all. It would be the art of speaking and writing, perhaps. That would be more in keeping with the phenomenological spirit. Even if one were to seek the ideal, one would do so only via the written word. Yeah. So Derrida, of course, is deeply indebted to Husserl because the whole idea of looking at this fissure and also this sort of relationship between that which is pure and that which is contaminated is something that he gets because of the epoche, so he does pay tribute to this epoche while doing so. Okay. Thank you so much.